Litro, written and recorded by Valerie O'Riordan. Once, years ago, he'd seen a movie about just this, a middle-aged bloke spying on his ex-wife, and he'd thought, mate, get a grip. That fella's a head case, he'd said to Kathy, and she'd said, oh, come on, Harry, he loves her. And now look, he'd even worn his shades, as if she'd failed to recognise him, as if he'd changed that much in a year. He had changed, though, that was the point. He'd cut back the drinking, he'd dropped a stone, he'd sorted out the garden. He'd kept the list from the couples counselling, the one he'd scrawled during the final session, sort yourself out. And he'd ticked everything off, even cooking. Last month he'd managed a smoky sausage casserole. He'd done the dishes, called Kathy and left a message. Can we talk? But it was Sophie who'd called him back. Dad, leave it, she's seeing somebody. She's seeing Arthur. Arthur. Saint Arthur by all accounts, or by Kathy's account anyway, when she finally picked up the phone. Arthur was kind, she said. Arthur was creative. Arthur gave back to the community. Well, as far as he could tell, as far as he'd gleaned from Facebook, Arthur was an arsehole, claimed the dole and suckered onto Kathy. That's what Arthur did. So now he'd come to see for himself. Well, not so much to see, but to set the fella straight. Kathy wasn't his to scoop up like a scrap of plastic off the footpath. She wasn't a big society project. She was his, Harry's, wife. No amount of pouncing about in a high-vis jacket picking up rubbish was changing that. They'd gathered on the Irwood Road entrance to the Fallowfield Loop, all volunteers, righteousness steaming off them like the fumes from the biscuit factory down the road. Saint Arthur was up front with his baldy head and grabber claw, and there was Kathy too, beside him, in her old red cagoule and pale blue jeans and a pink bobble hat belonging to Sophie. Sophie, though, he took out his phone and texted her, "Where are you?" She wrote back immediately, "Home in bed because I'm not a freaky stalker." He said, "Dunno what you mean, I'm a good citizen." 2 blue ticks. She didn't reply. So much for, what do they call it online? Allyship. He looked back up. Kathy was offering the baldy interloper a sip from her thermos. His thermos, in fact. He could see the city logo from all the way back here. Well, he thought, he'd reclaim that too. "Right," shouted Arthur. "We'll head as far as Reddish Bridge, OK? And then back to Slade Lane. Everyone got bags? Gloves? Lovely stuff." A cheer from the crowd, and they slowly spread out along the cycle path. He stayed at the back, keeping a good 30-yard buffer between himself and the litter-picking rear guard. Observe, but don't be observed. Like a bird watcher, he thought. The 2 nearest women weren't far off birds either. Magpies, snatching at anything that didn't belong. Fag packets, nitrous oxide canisters, polystyrene coffee cups. His back hurt just thinking about bending that far down. He didn't care about the rubbish anyway. Or, he did care, obviously he did. He liked the loop, he went for walks along here, and he didn't want to treat it like a wheelie bin. But he had bigger concerns. He needed a plan, something to teach Lord Litter up there a lesson. The temptation, he hadn't said this to Sophie, was to shove him into the watery ditch beyond the entrance to Highfield Park while Kathy wasn't looking. Or heave him in front of a cyclist. That wouldn't be hard. It was like the Gorton Grand Prix along here on a Sunday morning. 8 straight miles of Deliveroo bikers and kids doing wheelies on BMXs. He'd gone up the other way last Sunday, to the Fallowfield Sainsbury's, and he'd seen a cargo bike with 4 dogs in the trailer part, the dogs wearing little puffer jackets. Shove old Arthur under that lot and there'd be no getting up again. But no, he thought, watching Arthur disappear briefly into the gloom beneath the Stockport Road underpass. He couldn't injure the bloke. That wouldn't do him any favours. One time he'd been lamped by a United fan on the bus coming home from the derby. He'd thrown a punch back, missed, bruised his knuckles off the window, and all Kathy had said was that if she'd wanted to marry a boxer, she'd have joined the bloody gym. That was the point though, wasn't it? She'd married him, not Arthur. And they weren't divorced yet. What was she doing? Seeing somebody. He wasn't seeing somebody. Not because he hadn't thought about it. Of course he had. He'd eyed people up. The Sainsbury's cashier last Sunday for one, and Sandra the crossing guard, and a woman he'd seen just along here actually, the chain by Fleetwood Mac leaking out her headphones as he'd strode past on his evening walk. But he'd not spoken to any of them. He didn't know how he'd even go about it. Last time he'd been on the market, when he'd met Kathy, you'd send your mate on first. "My friend fancies your friend." You'd sink at least 4 pints before you dared sidle over, and even then the talk would be pitiful. "You all right? Yeah, you all right?" He couldn't fathom how Kathy had managed it. how she'd started up with this fella at all. Past Crayfield Road now, topping the rise before the path dipped again beneath Broom Lane. And there they were, clustered round a shopping trolley dumped in the long grass to the right. Abruptly he swivelled, crouched, fiddled with his shoelaces, tried to listen in. Cathy was talking, and Arthur replying, but he couldn't make it out. Louder, he wanted to roar. Let me in! But he stayed down, stage dumb. It was Sophie who'd explained the obvious. Cathy was on the dating apps. She said he should be doing the same, that he should let her know if he needed help getting started. But he didn't want to get started. He wanted to see what Cathy had started. He'd coaxed Sophie into sending him a screenshot of her mother's profile. FFS, she'd said, but she'd pinged it on over. And there was Cathy, or a version of her at least, in lipstick and earrings. He'd not liked it. She'd never gone in for lipstick before. She didn't look like herself. And she'd put down that she was into Kendrick Lamar. He'd pulled up a playlist on Spotify to have a listen, and he was left more baffled than he'd started, standing at the kitchen counter, scowling at the Echo Dot like the world had gone around in musical chairs and he'd lost. Harry no seat, Harry no wife, Kendrick effin' Lamar. He risked a glance round, and they'd gone. Brilliant, he thought. He'd dawdled, and now he'd lost her. Faster then. He strode onwards. This whole stretch of path had been a railway when he was a lad. A decommissioned railway, mind. He used to come down with his mates and throw rocks at the old station windows. If you'd have told him then, son, you'll still live local at 52, these tracks will be a funny old stretched out park, and you'll go walking there for fun, he'd have said you were taking the mick. But that was his routine now. Back from work, out for a stroll. He did his best thinking along here, because the house, Cathy's curtains still up, her carpets underfoot, was no good anymore. It got him mushy. It got him cross. The fresh air suited him. The drizzle even. White sun poking through a slit in the sheet metal sky. No screens, no apps. A bit of muck underfoot, rats scuttling in the brambles. A bit of peace. On a good day he'd go as far as the Gorton Reservoir. He'd gotten to recognise the evening joggers. He'd salute them. They'd nod back. Highfield Park to his right now, pedestrian bridge to the left, the ditch below. No sign of Cathy. Faster again. He was almost trotting. He'd gone properly jogging once, him and Cathy. She'd read an article online, Fit at 50. She'd bought herself a talking watch and started subscribing to YouTube videos, skinny girls in lycra going on about hydration. Come on, Harry, she'd said, it'll be good, invigorating. Besides, she didn't want to run alone. It wasn't safe, she'd said, not for her. He'd be fine, but... They'd warmed up in the Stockport Road tunnel. Star jumps, touchdowns, him feeling like a proper chump, sweating before he'd hardly begun. And then the jogging itself. Christ, it nearly ended him. Cathy had sprinted on ahead. Come on, Harry, knees up! Irwood Road to Highfield Park. He'd topped the rise by the C of E school, the rise he'd just topped. A pack of kids on their lunch break roaring through the fence. Faster, mister, faster! Then down where the path flattened, trees on either side. Birch, maybe. Ash, he didn't know then and he didn't know now. Under the bridge at Nelstrop Road with the fat pipe overhead, the poo pipe, Sophie used to call it. And on, until just as he thought he was seriously risking a stroke, he'd caught sight of her again, 100 yards or so ahead, near the turn-off for Longford Road and Reddish, surrounded by a group of lads. He'd felt panic rise, Facebook posts about muggings and assaults, daylight attacks, gang exposés in the MEN. And he tried to hurry, but his legs were wrecked, and by the time he'd reached her, they'd already moved on. Cathy was red-faced, spiteful. Thanks for that, she'd snapped. I really appreciated your support there, Harry. It's lovely to know I'm not alone in these situations. She'd left him there, run back home by herself, and neither of them had ever mentioned it again. He'd not mention it now, probably, even if she caught him trailing her down this very stretch. He'd just passed the Longford Road junction. Because what would he say? It wasn't that he blamed jogging for his marriage ending. Or those lads, they'd done nothing. Or Cathy, not really. They'd had separate bedrooms for years. He snored, she thrashed. She had her friends, he had his. She had her pub quizzes, he had his city games. When she'd moved out, nothing much had really changed. Not day to day. He'd tidied more. He'd bought a Jamie Oliver book. The house wasn't any quieter. He wasn't much lonelier. But he was lonely all the same. And lately he'd started wondering if they'd not gotten it wrong. Maybe this new start, as the counsellor had put it, was a false start. If things weren't better now, apart, Mightn't it be a decent plan to go back to being lonely together? He'd put this to her, he'd decided. Just a thought, a non-confrontational thought, and so he'd picked up the phone. And now this Arthur business. He'd felt it like a punch in the throat. This stranger, this do-gooder in his bloody wax jacket, and Cathy smiling at him, touching his wrist. No, he'd not planned for this. It wasn't right. He didn't want it. He passed the trading estate, Kentwood Road, and reached the narrow bridge over the Reddish Railway, where he stopped and squinted. That was hardly Arthur's brigade ahead coming towards him. On the way back already. Oh, he wasn't ready for that. He hadn't a plan, didn't want Cathy seeing him like this miserable cross. So hide, he thought. Gorton Cemetery was off to the right. He clambered over the embankment, in the pedestrian gate, and began to pick his way along the rows, past all the dearly beloveds, the sodden bouquets, bending to examine the odd one in an effort to fit in, to look like a legitimate visitor. In fact, they'd buried Cathy's dad here last year, not too far back either. He started looking for the stone in earnest. Philip Lohman, smooth granite, hip height to Cathy. He'd had a good cry at the funeral. He didn't mind admitting that. He'd liked Philip, a fellow blue, a funny bloke, teetotal, played the flute, refused to remarry despite Cathy's badgering. Once bitten, he'd said. His ex, Marianne, Cathy's mam, had moved to Brighton back in 99, got a job driving HGVs. She'd died a few years ago too. Cancer. He missed them both. They'd have had solid takes on all this separation business. Advice. Counsel. Sort your head out, son. His head was a mess, he'd grant them that. He stopped by a mossy rock, Ellery somebody, the letters worn down by rain or touch, and tried to gather himself. What was he like? Hiding. Breathe in for 4, out for 4. Self-care, Sophie called this. Ground yourself. Go on then, he thought. Fluff of a squirrel darting past, a child's rattle in the grass, early daffodils, E for Ellery, the downstroke exactly a finger width, cold stone, colder wind. OK, all right then. He straightened, saluted Philip wherever he was, and walked slowly back to the gate. Home. A normal afternoon. Cup of tea. Call Sophie. Reassure her. No baldy knobheads have been harmed in the making of this production. Watch the football. Read a bit. Day by stupid day. There they were now, all right. The litter pickers, strolling past in a chatty clump. The ladies from before, magpies, bags full. And Arthur, of course, cocky tosser, holding forth. Cathy listening, laughing. She looked up then, saw him paused halfway down the embankment and, startled, waved. All right, he said. Yeah, she said. All right.
Litro, written and recorded by Valerie O'Riordan, with music by Oscilloscope, and the series editor was Richard V. Hurst. You Are Here is produced by Levenshulme Old Library. It was commissioned by The Space and made possible with support from Arts Council England.